Hi, this is Cameron back. I'm going to do something a little bit different now. I'm going to quickly review and show off a book that I formally reviewed in Popular Music and Society Journal about 12 years ago. And that's a book by the name of Los Beatles in Cuba, un viaje magico y misterioso. So the Beatles in Cuba, a magical mystery tour. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen this book before. It came out in Havana in 1997. Unfortunately, there aren't any pictures in the book, so there's not much to show on the inside. Can show the page that shows off where where it was published and all of that. So this book is the proceedings of the first international colloquium on the significance of the Beatles' work in Cuba. It took place October 15th to 17th, 1996. And at that conference, they discussed the social and cultural impact of the British band and their songs on Cubans from the 1960s up to the present day. And I'll just look through a few of the different chapter headings on the first half of the book and let you know what it was about. So some of the topics were about people's memories of dancing to the Beatles, about how they had sort of created an underground culture of listening to the Beatles. The Beatles, sort of a review of Revolver, talking about A Hard Day's Night, talking about how some of Lennon and McCartney's songs deal with money. You know, Baby, Not a Rich Man, and compared the Beatles to the influence of Los Panchos, a famous trio. In any case, those articles are not so interesting. What did interest me in the book was a very interesting controversy about whether or not the Beatles were prohibited from early 1964 until mid-1966 in Cuba. So whether or not there existed laws that prohibited listening to the Beatles at that time. Now, some people at this conference claimed, yes, in fact, there did exist laws, even if they were just secret laws, prohibiting listening to the Beatles in Cuba. And others say no, but there seems to be some evidence that from personal experience, that certain self-appointed guardians of the Cuban Revolution would stop young people and who had mop-top haircuts or had tight pants, and would cut off their hair right on the street and confiscate their Beatles albums. So, so some of the arguments to say that the Beatles were prohibited were that, in fact, as I said, you could get your Beatles records prohibited. There was an argument that there's no evidence that the Beatles were ever played on Cuban radio between 1964 and mid-1966. So some of the arguments of why that would have happened was because they were singing in the English language, which is the language of the enemy, the United States. Some of the other arguments were that the revolution was just new, and so therefore this Beatles music and the cultural revolution that they represented were something against the values, the traditional cultural values that the Cuban Revolution was trying to revitalize and strengthen. So, but on the other hand, people were able to bring home Beatles albums from abroad, and it was never taken away by the the different guards at the airport. Also, people were able to make unauthorized copies of the Beatles records at government-owned recording booths. Also, different unauthorized copies were available through different networks, quite cheap. So people were able to also listen to the Beatles freely on the beaches on BBC and other radio, shortwave or midwave radio stations. So really, by the end of this conference, there's great disagreement about whether or not the Beatles were ever censored by the Cuban government or not. Now, I think that the arguments really come down to, on both sides, show that, in fact, they probably were never officially censored, but that the cultural renaissance of Cuba under the revolution, the so-called renaissance and revitalization of traditional values, were responsible for the lack of dissemination of the Beatles' cultural revolution. Yet some young people obviously were able to break through this kind of self-imposed censorship within the country and really grow to love the Beatles and identify with the Beatles' cultural revolution. So, just a personal experience. When I did travel to Cuba in 2004 and went to a bookstore, I asked the bookstore owner, in fact, whether he had any kind of memories of the Beatles being censored, and he says, yes, for sure, there really was a censorship. I remember that people would on the streets get their hair cut, and the people would take away, confiscate their Beatles records. So that's one anecdotal evidence that, in fact, there was some form of self-censorship, if not secret laws. The second thing is that I had a chance to visit the John Lennon Park. So in Havana, the John Lennon Park was inaugurated sometime early in the 20th century, early in the 21st century. It's a bench with John Lennon sitting there. I had a chance to get my photo taken sitting beside John Lennon. Supposedly at the inauguration of that park, Fidel actually stated, contrary to this idea of having official censorship, that he wasn't even aware that the Beatles existed at that time in 64 to mid-66. He didn't even know that the Beatles even existed. It was just outside of his range of awareness. And that, in fact, if he had been aware, he would have embraced views, the open-mindedness of the Beatles. So there you go. This is a book that would interest very many Beatles and people that are interested in Cuban culture from 1964 to 1966. Los Beatles in Cuba, un viaje magico y misterioso. So the Beatles in Cuba, a magical mystery tour, and it's all in Spanish. So unfortunately, a translation has never been made. You can leave your comments at the bottom and let me know if you have any questions about the book. I will leave a reference to where my official review of the book has been published in Popular Music and Society at the bottom, and you could go and look it up and read further about my in-depth review. So that's all for now. Have a good day, and I look forward to hearing from you. Bye-bye.